Hey guys, how's it going? I wanted to check in with you, and I guess I'm going to start this vlog weekly reading wrap up kind of oddly. So, you may have seen, hopefully, in the opening clips, that I was doing some reading in my reading sprints, and I started one of the books off my TBR, The Vegetarian. And if you saw the clips, you could probably tell from my face that there were quite a few shocking things going on in the book. So far, I am 46 pages in, and I don't know if I'm going to make it. This is only 199 pages long, but if you remember from my TBR game, I'm supposed to be doing a finish or diminish with this book. That means I need to either finish this book, or if I decide to DNF it, I have to go on to another book off the shelf that I pulled it from and keep reading until I finally finish a book. So I may end up clearing out that whole shelf. And whatever I decide not to read off that shelf, I need to unhaul it. It can't be a let me put it off, for another 5 years or so and come back to it kind of situation. So I really want to keep going in this book, but I don't know if it's going to happen. And sorry, I'm like totally just jumping right into this video, but I guess that's just how it's going to be. I don't want to make this a long check-in. All I can say is that the thing that is giving me pause is the amount of just graphic on-page violence to both people and animals at this point. I don't know if I can handle both in one book. I don't even know that. I mean, I don't tend to like graphic or gratuitous violence or anything for that matter in my books. And I knew this was going to have some. I just didn't know to the extent. And then I finally looked up some more content warnings and I don't know. So I've taken a break from the book, from the moments that you may have seen earlier, and I'm reaching over here to grab this book, The Book of Delights. I put this down and picked up this book, and I've been listening to the audiobook. I'm about 50% of the way through. I feel like that was the perfect sort of mental palate cleanser and calmer, and I'm ready to go back to this. I don't know. But if you're interested to see whether or not I can finish this book, or whether or not I DNF it and end up reading something else, or end up telling you about this, or if this ends up being a reading wrap up or a vlog, I don't know what this video is about to be, but keep watching and we'll find out together. So for The Vegetarian, I'm just going to maybe do one other check-in before I finish the book, if that, if I can handle it. Or if I decide to switch books, I'll come back and let you know that. But I'm going to keep these clips brief because I'm pretty sure I'm going to want to combine this with the weekly reading wrap up. But you never know. We'll see. Okay, hello, welcome. I'm back and I'm over here on the floor by my bookshelves because it's a no. It's not going to happen. There's no way I can push myself through and force myself to finish this book. So I'm not going to. That's not because the book is bad. It's just there are certain things that I'm really sensitive to, and I can only take so much graphic on-page violence to humans and animals, and this has both. And it seems like it's going to have a lot. I will read something else by Han Kang. It's just not going to be this book for my choice, which means I do need to go back to my shelves because, as I'm pretty sure I said at some point in that mess of a beginning, I need to keep reading books from this shelf until I finally finish one. So I thought I'd bring you over to the shelves to show you which shelf it is. And it's this one right here that you can see. It's in the lower corner. So some of the books on here have been read. Some of them have not been read yet. And the other thing I should mention about this shelf is it has books whose titles begin with the letter U, which are these here, as well as books whose title begin with the letter V, which you can see here. And I'm going to allow myself to choose from either, even though the original letter I pulled in my TBR game was the letter V. So let me real quickly just show you what the options are. I'm not going to talk about what these books are about. I'm just going to show you the books and their title. I guess I'll start with the V pile since that's what I was pulling from. The Complete Paintings of Vincent van Gogh, The Valley Nearby, Vathek by William Beckford, Virginia by Ellen Glasgow, The Vicar of Wakefield, Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. There's Ulysses, which is absolutely not happening right now, and The Uncommercial Traveler. And then this book, The Unlikely Escape of Uriah Heep, and the other one down there is The Underground Railroad. I've read those too, so I won't be picking from those. And then I have one more book that is on this shelf, or goes on this shelf, and that is Under the Eye of the Big Bird. And this is the big book I'm going to pick. And I feel like it's kind of cheating, but the reason I'm going to pick it is because it's already on my TBR. So I kind of feel like it prevents me from necessarily having to add an unexpected book onto my TBR, but still meets like the whole finish and diminish challenge goals, right? I mean, I'm making the rules, so I'm gonna say right. So, yeah, I'm gonna read this. Let me get going. I'll let you know what I end up thinking about this book if I finish it. And if not, we'll be back over here picking a different book. Okay, so this is definitely going to be more of a reading wrap up, but the good news is I did finish Under the Eye of the Big Bird. So let me start my wrap up of the books with this book that I finished, which thankfully I finished this because I don't know that there was anything else from that shelf that I wanted to read. This book is by Hiromi Kawakami. It was first published in 2016 and then later translated into English, which is what it allowed it to win, or sorry, be shortlisted for the 2025 Booker International Prize. It is translated by Asa Yoneda and is a work, I would say, of science fiction first and foremost. But definitely the writing style is on the literary side, which I think is how it got nominated for the Booker International Prize. But after having read this book, I'm not surprised it didn't win. But I am surprised that it made it all the way to a shortlist because I think this is the most science fiction like book that I've ever seen on that prize list. And I kind of wish they would step more outside the genre of just solidly literary fiction, but what can you do? Anyway, this is a work of science fiction. It definitely has a theme of a dystopian novel going on, though there is a little bit of an element of utopian in there, or a society working towards utopia for sure. The other element of this book that I would say really stood out to me is that it's somewhere between soft sci-fi and hard sci-fi, and I'll explain that as I go along and talk about what this book is about. So this is a book that is told basically in interconnected stories. Each chapter, for the vast majority of the book, deals with a different character, is told from their viewpoint or from their perspective, and that's because the world that they are living in is a world, it's Earth for sure, but it is a time and a place where things have fallen apart and humanity is on the brink of extinction. And in an attempt to rebuild human society, the humans have been scattered across the earth, those of them that are remaining, or across whatever continent they're on, and they are each in different, separate, isolated communities where they are trying to survive and to rebuild society in their own space and way. And there is fragile hope for the future in all of these places. And it's really interesting how all of that is done. I was not expecting the sort of like interconnected short story feel of the book because nowhere on the back of the book did it mention anything about that. And I get it because it is one coherent story, but definitely at the start of the book, you're going to feel like you're reading a set of short stories. This book covers a variety of different topics, including touching on climate disasters. It's definitely about humans and humanity and, goes along with that dystopian survival trope a bit. And there is a lot of talks about genetic and genetic engineering and cloning and just different ways of creating humans and humanity. And there is discussion of robots and AI as well. I think the high in this book for me was definitely the world building, which is done over the course of the novel. And I think it's really well done the way that things are revealed to you about the world. You get a little bit in each story. And initially it's confusing because, like I said, the different communities are each approaching things in their own way. So it doesn't necessarily feel like you're on the same world at the beginning of the book. And it takes a while for you to get an idea of the broader scope of things. But that does come. The low in me for this book was how long it took to come. And I honestly think that's why this book doesn't have the highest ratings and why a lot of people don't end up liking it. I did feel like the story itself was too drawn out in terms of what the plot and the point and the purpose was and the explanation of what was going on. It just took too long for everything to come together. And it's not a particularly long book, but it felt long. Like I said, I think the book is told in 2 or 3 parts, and you have to make it all the way through part one, story after story after story, chapter after chapter, to finally get to a point where you're starting to understand what's even happening. And it wasn't in a suspenseful manner. It felt like sort of irritating, honestly, and at times like just flat out confusing. So I think that was handled and done rather awkwardly and definitely makes it a struggle to get into the book. I would say if you really want to give this book a chance, you've got to make it through part one and at least into the first chapter or two of part two, which at that point you stop getting like broken sentences and shorter sentences, and the narrative flow really picks up and takes over, and you get sort of a bigger reveal that helps start tying everything together. Uh, the only other issue that I had with the way the plot was done, and I mentioned earlier that this was a weird mix between soft sci-fi and hard sci-fi, is that at the very end of the book, you get a huge explanation of what's going on that honestly, to me, just felt like a gigantic info dump where everything was explained, everything was worked out, the causes, the solutions, the ideas. And at that point, it suddenly became hard sci-fi where you realized you were going to get a lot of information on how everything was working all at once. And I personally didn't like that. I really don't like hard sci-fi books where all the hard science comes in like the last chapter. I would rather be introduced to it slowly over time, and I did not feel like that happened in this book. And so I think it's one of those things where if you make it through the beginning of the book, you might then struggle at the end of the book, especially if you're not a fan of info dumps. Now, if you like to just chew on a large piece of science all at once, this may work well for you. I don't know. For me, it was just okay in some ways. I still at this point, and this is like a week after I've finished this book, really couldn't tell you whether I truly liked this book or didn't. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars because I didn't dislike it, but I didn't really like it. I think I'm just left kind of unsure. I think this is a book that I'd have to read again or at least have sit on my shelf for a while before I could really decide whether or not I truly liked the book. I think this book is a book that would work well for people who like slow-paced books, who like science fiction but don't mind if the writing style is more on the literary side. There's times where the writing style even felt whimsical or like you were reading a fairy tale in some of the chapters. So there were moments where it was like just really beautifully written. I think you would also like this book if you really like a slow, drawn out explanation of what's happening in a story, and then don't mind having the reveal all happen at the end. Also, this is a great book if you are someone who likes science fiction that is set on Earth and that is focused on human and biology over set in space and focused on like physics and that kind of thing. Other books this reminded me of are the Xenogenesis series by Octavia E. Butler. Personally, I think that's a better series if you want to look at humans trying to survive and the lengths that they would go to and considering different ways of doing that. I like the themes in that book a lot better. It's a lot more, the pacing is better, and I just found the entire series a better read. I also think if you enjoy the writing style in this, another book with a similar writing style, I think would be To Be Taught It Fortunate by Becky Chambers. The writing styles aren't exactly the same, but I think the more whimsical and poetic moments in this book felt to me like all of the writing in To Be Taught It Fortunate. So if you liked this book or you tried this book and it wasn't quite working for you, you might want to check out those too. So that is that book. I do have two other books that I talked to you about because I decided that I just have too many books going on this month to only talk about one or two books in this video. So I am going to conclude this video by talking about two other books that I read, or really one other book that I read and one book that I DNF'd. I'll start with the book that I DNF'd. Since my February TBR was released, I did attempt to read the Revisionaries, and I decided it is a no-go for me. I picked this book up ages ago. It's one of the oldest books on my bookshelves in terms of length of time that I've owned it. It's a nice chunky book. It sounded weird and it is weird, and that's not what bothered me about this book and made me decide to put it down. It's actually the perspective on mental health that is taken in this book. This book is, I believe, meant to be sort of humorous and tongue-in-cheek in the way that its story is told, but it is set on a place called Looney Island where all the loonies live. and the loonies have escaped the loony bin. And yes, it's talking about people who have mental health problems, and that is the way they are characterized and described by everybody in the book. And I'm sure there is some deeper meaning in that, but I read the first like 40 pages of the book and couldn't find it. And I personally just find the state of mental health in the US too much of a major concern to read a book that straight off the bat is going to characterize it as something to be sort of laughed at and made fun of, even if it's just by using a off name and word. I did look at an author interview and just to kind of see what his thoughts were or his ideas on using that term. And it was something that he didn't even address. And so for me, it's a pass. And then the final book I have to review, I feel like needs some like huge major announcement because this is a booktube beloved book in some spheres. And that book would be Stoner by John Williams. Yeah, I finally read this book, and if you guys follow me on the story graph, you know what's about to come. So let me start out by telling you what Stoner is about, give you a little background information. This is a work of literary fiction published in 1965 by John Williams. And despite it, at the time it was published, being received with like pretty little fanfare and doing, pretty average as far as the books go, it has more recently been re-released, particularly by New York Review of Books, to overwhelming success. Like people love this book and use all the superlatives with it, and it's like an overnight sensation in literary fiction in some ways. And even on the back of this book, it is described as something rarer than a great novel. It is a perfect novel. So well told and beautifully written, deeply moving, so deeply moving that it takes your breath away. It's also described as being one of the most extraordinarily fine novels published in the past 50 years, utterly riveting, and that John Williams treats his characters with such tender and ruthless honesty that we cannot help but love them. So there's that on the back of the book, which to me normally would have been a sign that like, that seems like a little crazy amount of praise, but people love this book. A lot of people have this as their best book of the year, give it 5 stars and all the like. And what is this story about? Well, it tells the story of William Stoner, who is a young man turned basically literary genius. He goes from being a young farm boy, and it's not a coming of age story because he's not that young at the start of the book. It kind of glosses over a lot of his childhood, but he grows up on a farm. He ends up being sent to college by his parents to study agriculture and very quickly realizes that he has a deep love for literature and books, which as a book lover, I can totally appreciate. And that was the part of this book that I was expecting to connect to the most. It is a classic rags to reader story, and his love of literature is something that would definitely connect with the book world. And you get to follow his life as he goes from farm to university in all the mundanity of his everyday life in early 1900s Missouri. Now, the highs of this book for me were the writing. I thought it was good. It was even better than I personally was expecting, though I didn't have any like high expectations of the writing per se, despite what people say about it. But I thought the writing was good. I didn't think it was like mind-blowing best writing I've ever read in my entire life. But it was good writing. It was very clear. I think maybe it just surprises people because I do feel like John Williams is not like a well-known author that we all know about. So I could see in that sense, if you picked up this book, having never heard about it on social media, that kind of thing, that it could be a really pleasant and surprising read in terms of that. The lows in this book, however, for me, were the characterization. The way that Stoner himself was characterized as a saint and a stoic, the way the wife was characterized as a deranged harpy, and the way the daughter is characterized as a lucky alcoholic. Yep, that's right. I also didn't like the overall messaging in this book that despite everything that Stoner did, it was all okay because he was just able to make it through, love his books, do his job, and, he kind of sort of made it right in the end. No, he didn't. So that's all I'm going to say about my lows without spoilers. I generally try to keep my book reviews spoiler free, but I'm now going to go into some spoilers and I'm going to try not to rant about this book. But I gave it 2 stars and I want to tell you why. In fact, when I initially rated this book, I gave it 1 star. That's how much I did not like this book. But I bumped it up slightly to a 2 star because I wanted to take into account that there is some good writing going on here at times, and that it's clearly a very persuasive book. And that gets me into talking about the messaging of this book. I felt like this book landed somewhere between really good persuasive writing and just flat out gaslighting the readers. And let's get into it and start by talking about the characterization of the couple of people that I mentioned in this book and how I feel like all of John Williams' writing is there trying to persuade you of his perspective and view of these characters, and quite frankly, I just wasn't buying it. Let's start with Stoner, who is our saint. He is our class stoic. He is personally, in my opinion, a scrub, like 1990s TLC scrub. Yeah, let's talk about what this book says about him. He is like a pretty bland character, to be honest, and that's supposed to be part of his appeal. He is supposed to be just your everyday guy. This is a book that is like realistic fiction where it's just showing the realities of life of a young man who grew up on a farm, went to university with, very little knowledge and just kind of goes through the suffering of life, doesn't really understand what's happening, suffers a lot just because of who he is and the things that life throws at him. And, he comes out kind of, sort of, not really on top, but on top in his mind. And that's the thing that's maybe the most important to him and certainly to John Williams and hopefully to you, the reader. However, I didn't really buy the, Stoner as stoic and saint and, person to emulate and find amazing. And let me tell you why. So, John Williams himself is mentioned in the introduction of this book as seeing Stoner as a real hero. And he even talks about how a lot of people think that Stoner had a sad or a bad life, but in John Williams' opinion, Stoner actually had a good life, and that's what he is trying to get to come across in the book. And the idea is that Stoner's life is good because he has a job, the job is important to him, he's doing what he loves, and that is the most important thing to him. And this idea of him doing what he loves and that love is essential and that when you love something, you truly understand it, is going to become really important when we talk about his wife, Edith, later. However, what I found about Stoner is that he was a very passive person who just let everything in life happen to him, whether it was good or bad. A lot of the suffering he went through was at his own hands and of his own making and because of his own passivity. And I found nothing impressive about that. I found that to be rather insufferable of Stoner himself. I didn't find that he had a very stoic nature where he was just taking life as it came and kind of, staying centered and trudging through. I felt like there were a lot of narrative passages where horrible things would happen, frequently to other people, and that the following language and diction and syntax after those scenes would be directed at Stoner and helping the reader feel bad for him, not to the person who maybe actually experienced said tragedy. The funny thing that I find about this book is that even Stoner himself has moments of clarity where he sees himself as he actually is portrayed in the book based on his own actions. And then he immediately convinces himself and possibly the reader that the reality of how he's been presented is not actually how or who he is. So, for example, pretty late in the book, again, there are going to be spoilers from here on out. I'll put up on the screen the time where I stop talking about spoilers, and you can just skip to that and hear about my book recommendations and other books that I would recommend instead of Stoner. But anyway, late in the book, Stoner has like sort of an epiphany about himself. For a moment, he saw himself as he must thus appear. A pitiable figure going into his middle age, misunderstood by his wife, seeking to renew his youth, taking up with a girl years younger than himself, awkwardly and apishly reaching for the youth he could not have. He looked at this figure as closely as he could, but the longer he looked,
the less familiar it became. It was not himself that he saw, and he knew suddenly that it was no one. So he has this moment where he sees himself as other people might see him, and honestly, he sees himself as I saw him at that point in the book. But then that fades, and he's like, nope, that's not me. In fact, no one's actually like that. Yeah, that is you. And there are plenty of people who are like that. Those people don't just exist in cheap fiction, which is, the idea of where he got it from. Those people don't just exist on the page. Those people exist in real life too. And honestly, like if they only exist in cheap fiction, they exist in this book. So I don't know what that's saying about the book, but let us go on. There's another moment after Stoner has had the affair and he's then in this huge conflict with Lomax, the other professor, and everyone in the school knows about this situation, but they're so removed from it at this point that it's just a rumor mill, and people are trying to figure out why there's beef between him and him and Lomax. And it says, sometimes he, being Stoner, was villain. In one version that attempted to explain the long feud between himself and Lomax, he had seduced and then cast aside a young graduate student for whom Lomax had had a pure and honorable passion. That 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 wasn't a rumor, like that actually happened. You did have an affair with one of your students. That that was something that happened, and it did paint you as a villain because it was sort of villainous behavior, even though in this book it's described as being, the love of his life and like the most romantic thing that happens in the book, despite the fact that you have a situation where he is, you have an age gap romance, if you can call it a romance, which may not bother some people, but you definitely have issues with someone who's in the power of authority. He is a professor at a college. He has an affair with one of his students who is a graduate student who is basically in some manner reliant on his opinion of her work for her graduate program. He has an affair with her. She is characterized as just being this, wild, lustful woman who, once he starts dating her, can never seem to manage to stay dressed in anything than like a bathrobe that is just slung over her constantly naked body. There are a lot of naked women in this book, which just seems on par for 1960s writing in some ways in general. Anyway, Stoner's relationship with her, which changes her character, and she goes from being a serious academic in the book to just sort of being, as she quotes it, the slut of the world. That's literally like the title that she claims for herself at one point in this book, which led me to not being able to take that relationship seriously. But then to later in the book act like that wasn't really what happened and to repaint that as just a silly story that people told is ridiculous. Yes, the last part of that statement about, this being why he and Lomax had this beef with one another because sort of implying Lomax had a thing for her, that part is untrue. But just because part of a statement is untrue doesn't make the entire statement untrue. Later, once he has a child, towards the end of his life, even Grace comes to him despite seeing how horrible his relationship has been with his mother, despite maybe knowing that he had an affair and that kind of thing. She, towards the end of her time with him, leads with this line of, "Poor daddy, things haven't been easy for you, have they?" And again, it's this idea that we should pity Stoner, that we should feel bad for Stoner. I think there's a reason that even John Williams noticed that people think that Stoner had a bad life. It's because the language in the book leads a reader to believe that he had a bad life. There's a lot of characterizing of Stoner as poor Stoner. All these bad things happen to you. What's Stoner to do? And then at the very end of the book, when Stoner is like literally on his deathbed, which I just thought was the most pathetic way to end his life in terms of like, if you didn't feel bad for him yet, feel bad for him now. It just felt very cliche to me in terms of like ending the bad life, if you will. But at the end, he looks at his wife, who he's had a horrible relationship with, and he's just like, oh, if I had just known more, I could have done more. I could have loved her more. That love is essential, and that when you love something, you truly understand it. And I also had a problem with that, which brings me to Edith, which was probably my biggest problem in this whole book is just the way that Edith was characterized, the things that were done to her in the book, specifically by Stoner, and then how everything about her and her response to that was characterized. So, to keep it brief, the things that I did not like about Edith's characterization was just how little of her own motivation we were given to some extent. In a lot of ways, Edith is just your typical, like, deranged woman in a marriage running around wreaking havoc and ruining everybody's good time. However, the little motivation that we are given for her behavior is super disturbing. When they first get married and they arrive at the hotel for their honeymoon, Edith is described in a way that almost makes it seem like she's having an anxiety attack over the idea of their wedding night. And this would make sense because she has been characterized as basically being somebody who's been brought up with little or no idea or thought surrounding sex and sexuality. And then they then go through a whole night and process where Stoner basically tries to get her tipsy so that she'll be, more comfortable, if you will. She kind of goes along with it. She more or less so gives up and resigns herself to the fact that they're going to have some sort of sexual relationships, and then immediately afterwards goes and vomits in the bathroom. Stoner, meanwhile, poor Stoner, who's really in love with her, just has no idea what's going on, can't possibly understand what's happening, and is more than willing to accept her excuse that the reason she vomited wasn't because she's so turned off by him, but just it was that second glass of champagne just didn't sit well on her stomach. Okay, fine. Even if we wanted to take Edith at her word, it then describes how for the next year he continues to essay her while she's sleeping because he loves her so much. That love is essential, and that when you love something, you truly understand it. Crazy, but I was not okay with that explanation of what was going on. And that's what happens to Edith. She is in a marital situation where she is being essayed, and it talks about for an entire year. And even the book describes what he's doing to her as a violation. And it even goes on to say at one point how his preference was to wake her up while she was sleeping, and that his favorite version was when she was sleep drugged, because then she wouldn't turn her face away from him. This is our saint. This is our stoic. This is the real hero of the novel, doing this to the deranged wife who we can't imagine why she has a problem with him. That love is essential, and that when you love something, you truly understand it. But wait, it doesn't stop there with Edith. She goes on to oddly not like Stoner after this, until one day she decides she wants to have a baby, at which point she gets described as bringing out her claws and will wait all day in bed naked for him, as one would do. Because again, we can't have a woman on page too long without having her completely unclothed and head over heels with lust for Stoner, because he's obviously such an amazing guy. I mean, who wouldn't just rip it off for him? Anyway, as the story goes on with Edith, she does manage to get pregnant because they're doing it like rabbits, so no surprise there. And at the end of that, she has a child, which then comes one of the best on page descriptions of postpartum depression I've ever read. But who do we feel bad for? Stoner. Because poor Stoner, he has to do some dishes while his wife can barely get out of bed, and they fear she's going to become an invalid. But what's Stoner to do? He's got to also parent. Weird. But for Stoner, it's a hardship. He's living the rough life here. Never mind his practically invalid wife in bed. So you then get this weird, like, Mr. Rochester and wife that you're keeping locked up in a room type of feel and vibe. But instead of having a moment where we feel bad for the wife or bad for the graduate student who's virtually Jane Eyre in this story, we feel bad for Mr. Rochester, aka Stoner. And I just wasn't feeling it. I wasn't buying it. I don't care how many times on the page it encouraged me to feel bad for Stoner. I didn't. And then finally, we got to Grace, and I know this is going long, and hopefully I will be able to edit it for you so that it's slightly shorter. But we do get to Grace, the daughter that Stoner and Edith managed to have out of their wild bunny time. And Grace grows up initially very close to Stoner, but her mother in her war that she wages on Stoner, again, for who knows what reason. But anyway, Edith decides to take Grace and keep Grace to herself. And of course, that's described as a battle. Edith is definitely pictured as being the villain in that situation. She's one of the few villains in the entire book in terms of how she's characterized. Grace grows up and obviously has problems, and she turns to drinking. And you can't just leave it as that being a problem. Her drinking by Stoner himself is described as something that is understandable and good for her, and at least she has that. And he basically sees it as like it's lucky that she's been able to become an alcoholic. I guess unlike Stoner, who's just had to live with the consequences of his behavior and has had nothing to turn to during that time. I don't know, but it was a really odd and weird way, to say the least, of looking at this destructive behavior that his daughter ended up having. So, as I said, I did not like this book. I did not like the characterization. I did not like the messaging of it. It's become, green eggs and ham for me, and it's not something that once I try, I found that I liked. And I'm not the only one who has these issues with the book, especially the issues with Edith. I could go on and do a whole standalone video on my problems with Edith in this book and this book's treatment of Edith and everything. But there are other people who have done that. I will post a video below that somebody else did specifically just talking about Edith, as well as a really good article that talks about all the problems with all the women in this book and how they are portrayed. And don't be turned off by that article by the fact that it's called a feminist view. A lot of people will see that and be turned off thinking that this is like a man-hating article. It's not. In literary critique, a feminist view of something means you read a book and you consider the role of gender and the role of women and what is happening to the women in the book, regardless of whether or not they are the protagonist of the book. And I think that article is really well done and touches on all the points in this book that I have regarding the women that I think are just miserable. So I'm sorry if you liked this book. I personally don't. I hope I've shared with you all the reasons that it is. If you watched or listened to, sort of all my counterpoints, if you will, feel free to leave in the comments below what you liked about this book, if you liked it, and what points you think make it a great book, and anything else you would like to comment on. Like, let's keep it nice. Let's keep it, a great conversation and not just like a baiting of other people. I don't think that's necessary. I'm not judging anyone who likes this book, and I'm not, and I hope you don't judge me for disliking it. I honestly think that there is a lot of persuading of the reader that Stoner is a hero, and I think the way people view this book is just going to be based on whether or not you think the writing of Stoner as a hero is effective or not. I personally found it ineffective, and I would not recommend this book personally. I think if you would like to read a book that addresses some of the things that Stoner is going through, but also addresses the issues I had in this book, but handled them much better, I would recommend Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, or The Man of Property, which is book 1 in the Forsyte saga. Particularly, that book actually has a very similar scene between wife and husband, and I think handles it way better. So that's it. Those are the 3 books that I have to talk about. 4 books. I guess I talked about 2 books in depth and the other 2 that I just am not going to read. And honestly, I wish I hadn't read Stoner. So that's it. Let me know your thoughts. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.